delighted to introduce Dr. Clarissa Giebel, who's a research fellow from the University of Liverpool. Hi, Clarissa.
Hello.
We have Sarah Wallcook, who is a PhD student at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden.
Hello.
Hi, Sarah. Everybody is immediately going to recognize, if they're like me, that you don't have a Swedish accent.
No, not at all.
And we have Monica Leverton, Leverton or Leverton?
Leverton.
Leverton. Monica Leverton, who's a PhD student at the Division of Psychiatry at UCL, and we've already had some people from the Division of Psychiatry at UCL earlier today. So hi, Monica.
Hi.
Thanks very much, everybody. So we've got 25 minutes, thereabouts. I'm going to start by asking you all to just briefly introduce yourselves and kind of your work. So Clarissa, you go first.
Okay, so you've nicely introduced me already. So I'm Clarissa Giebel. I work at the University of Liverpool. And so my research looks at how we can support people with dementia and the carers live independently at home for as long as possible. So I used to look a lot at daily activities and how people are actually performing daily tasks. But now I'm looking at how people are getting the right access to services that enables them to stay at home for as long as possible, but also looking at who doesn't get the services. So if people live in more rural areas or they don't have the money to pay for these services, that's my research in a nutshell.
Fantastic. Thank you, Clarissa. We'll come back and go into more detail in a little while. Sarah.
There's a lot of overlaps between me and Clarissa. I look at everyday technology and I'm an occupational therapist. At the moment, I'm very focused in on what's happening in rural areas. So I don't just look at how technology helps, but I also look at how it hinders in everyday life. So for everyday technologies, we're also thinking about kettles, toasters, but ticket machines in public space, for maybe ATMs for banking, how we're going to pay to get on public transport and things like that. So trying to assess the whole landscape of technologies for people living both with and without dementia.
That's a good point. I think there's a lot of research I've seen that talks about how technology should be embraced and how it's helping people, but not as much looking at how it's quite awkward, actually, maybe. Yeah. And Monica.
So again, my research is also really similar to Clarissa's. We've also had quite a lot of crossovers, so we meet up for cups of tea every now and then as well. So yeah, my PhD research has been all about looking at how people with dementia can stay independent at home with the support from home care workers. So it's my research is purely qualitative, so I'm not working with any numbers or figures. It's all talking to people, watching what people do and seeing how the role of home care can keep people as independent as possible at home.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So I'm going to pick on a few points to start with. Is it assumed that the default is that once people get their diagnosis of dementia, that they want to stay at home absolutely as long as possible? Is that a generic picture? Because I certainly know I've spoken to some people that are kind of like, actually, do you know what? I don't want to be, I don't want to kind of make life hard for my partner, and I'd rather move to. So generally speaking, I assume your work is about encouraging people to be wherever they want to be, rather than because the governments might say, oh, we want people to stay at home longer because it's cheaper than care homes or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's also about, particularly with dementia and the cognitive deficits, that people enjoy for as long as possible staying in their familiar environment. So if you imagine they are then suddenly being moved into assisted living or into a care or nursing home, it's completely different setting again. Where are the toilets, where's the dining room, and getting adjusted to that. So I suppose it's supporting them have a good quality of life and then feel safe as well where they used to live.
Absolutely. So actually, while we've got you then, Clarissa, tell us about your research first. Let's talk about your work.
I've briefly touched upon it already. So I suppose COVID has kind of thrown a bit of a curveball with everything. So I was working on a number of projects before COVID, for example, with Maastricht University, looking at how people are accessing care in both countries, so in the UK and the Netherlands. We did a big national survey and we spoke to people. What are your barriers to getting the care that you need? And then kind of COVID happened, and we kind of had to, this particular study is put on hold for now. But then we kind of shifted our focus and looked at, well, okay, we have all these public health restrictions in the UK and globally. So how are people still accessing the care they need in their own home? So we've started back in April, and we've spoken to people with dementia and carers, and we've done a longitudinal online and telephone survey where we explored the experiences of people in terms of, do you still access any care? How do you access it? Is it remotely? Is the remote support any good? Do you still get the right support? And some of the really sad things we've noticed so far is that people seem to have, well, first of all, they don't really get any support much, and the remote support isn't that good, but they seem to deteriorate faster just because they don't have that social engagement at the moment and that stimulation and going outside anymore. So it seems to have had a really, really bad impact on the lives of people with dementia.
Yeah, I think COVID clearly has. I mean, it certainly seems to, from the conversations I've had with early career researchers, particularly who've been trying to carry on or those working in clinical services, it certainly pushed forward the use of technology, which I don't think has been a negative. I think there are lots of positives to be found in this, providing that they're, used properly. I don't know if I'm making the point here that I wouldn't want to assume that the use of telemedicine or remote cognitive assessments or all these things is universally better. It was certainly better than doing nothing during what's happened over the last 6 months, but I think it does needs to be understood, because it's definitely not been helpful to everybody, has it?
No, and I think also we have to consider that many, particularly older people, they don't have access to internet necessarily, and they don't really know how Zoom might work, for example, or people with dementia, particularly if you have some certain subtypes like PCA, they have visual deficits, so they can't really engage with the visual side of having a support group via Zoom. So there's all these limitations there. It's good in some ways, but not helpful for everyone.
Yeah, I know Volkman's going to join us at the end of the day, and I know from talking to her a few weeks ago, some of the speech and language therapy sessions have been quite interesting, because being able to do that for those that were technologically enabled, not having to bring somebody in who had to then use public transport, have the anxiety of public transport coming into clinic, lots of sitting and waiting around, and added to their tiredness, that by the time they then got to the point of their assessment, it was influenced by their experience of the day, whereas when you could assess somebody remotely in their own home, they didn't have that. So that was one positive, but equally, as you say, that's great for the person that's got internet and not for the person down the road that doesn't have internet. Sarah, tell us about your work.
I think it's very interesting, your point about the internet and not having it, because I think one of the things that comes out in my research is that even landline telephones and televisions can be more problematic for some people, and particularly when you're thinking about people with dementia who are living alone, perhaps in more sparsely populated environments, and that's even more of a threat. People are really looking to rely on a service that they can access on a regular basis and that's easy to use. And so when you start to get service disruptions in there, perhaps due to things like the weather or whatever it might be, that can really upset somebody's everyday life and their confidence to live at home for as long as they want to live at home. So people I'm finding in my research that people are getting communicated to by their experience of using their technology. Every time they use it, they're getting a sense of confirmation back at them. Am I feeling competent today, or am I feeling a little bit more restricted, potentially more isolated because of what's going on? And when I think about the early days of COVID, that was when my research seemed to resonate most with just sort of ordinary people, because suddenly we were all struggling to get online, and suddenly we're all faced with technologies that should be simple, that weren't working, and that was affecting our ability to interact and to be with other people and to get on with our daily life. And I think what we find in our research is that that's just so much more common for people living with a cognitive impairment.
And you can see that there are, this question about living at home independently, that there are so many influences on that, whether somebody is living alone, for example, and or has somebody there day to day to support them. Practical things, whether they live in a bungalow or they've got stairs, because let's face it, they may have had, well, they most likely will have multiple other health issues as well that could be influencing this. And then, as you say, is the physical environment around them capable of supporting them? Do they live in a remote rural location where you can't get to place anymore? Monica, tell us about your research.
So I don't have a particular focus on technology. Mine's more thinking of people within their social context. So just to come back to your first question of, is it that once people get a dementia diagnosis, do they all want to stay at home? I think most people do want to stay in their own homes. It's where their whole lives have been. It's where all of their belongings are, all their memories are. And I think up until a certain point, people can continue as they had been, maybe with a bit more support from family carers, or, some people don't like the term family carers, but family members or neighbours or friends. But then there comes a point where that becomes a bit harder, and then home care comes in. And home care workers can really extend the time that people with dementia are able to live at home. But it does have a number of changes. People need to be accepting of receiving home care, which takes a bit of time. But so the work that I've been doing, I firstly interviewed, I think, 82 people overall, speaking to people with dementia, family carers, home care staff. And then I observed a number of home care workers as they did their work and they supported people with dementia to live at home, and sort of seeing the ways that they could support independence, but also what the challenges are and maybe what training is needed for care workers to enable independence for people with dementia. Because I think sometimes, because there's short visit times, a lot of different clients to see with travel in between, there can be the sort of mentality of, I'll just do it for them because I'll get it done quicker. But I think home care models are trying to move towards the more doing with, not for approach. So that's the work that I've been looking at, sort of how can you do with? And I think the term that I'm focusing on is interdependence. So thinking of people in their social context and how you can facilitate changes and adaptations to enable people to live independently as much as possible with the support of others at home.
And that's beyond as well, just the immediate family, like the family care. I mean, is this looking at kind of the whole family unit or the people around them? Because I think that, that kind of contribute. And sorry, just a second question was, is there any differences in different cultures that you've looked at, whereas this model is better delivered in certain cultures than in others?
Yeah, so I think the focus has been on home care. So sometimes, people don't actually have a family member at all. There is no one. The home care worker is the only contact they have. And then you sort of start to see those really close relationships that people form with their care worker. Looking at the sort of relationships that the care workers have with the family members, and a sort of united team all working together to support the person to live at home. And culturally, I think the difference there is people's willingness to introduce home care. We just, not my PhD specifically, but another sort of side study of the project I work on, the NIDA study, we looked at the views of South Asian carers and people with dementia. And, the difference there is a sort of care and support stays within the family. You don't bring in somebody else to do the care work that you're expected to do. So I guess more so than what actually happens when home care is introduced, it's starting off that introduction of care.
And you can see how there are good ways to go about that and bad ways as well. When that happens as part of a planned approach that's thought through, it's likely to be more effective than something that happens because of a crisis or an emergency or, you know, sudden change of circumstances.
Exactly. And I think sometimes when it's, as you said, when it's rushed and it's in response to an emergency, the care workers that I worked with were sort of saying, you know, they wish they knew the person before they got to this stage so that they could know what they were like as a person and build a relationship before it got to the point where they are just doing what the family carers are asking. They're not able to get the perspective of the client with dementia.
So how much, I mean, is there a general rule here? I mean, I don't know if you'd all agree with this or not, that planning, as much as I know, because I can imagine if this was me, I'd probably be one of those people that would probably bury my head in the sand about this to some extent. I'd be wanting to put off thinking about that and getting ahead. But is it generally better to think and plan ahead as much as you can? I mean, and we'll talk about whether that's thinking about the future and whether you're going to need a nursing home and which are the best ones and how's it going to cost, but also about has the person you're living with potentially their symptoms worsen, that you know, preparing yourself is getting a preparation. It's got to be right. A good thing, I would assume, all your research has shown.
Definitely. I think it really has, it should happen right after diagnosis, but then we have the huge issue in terms of diagnosis itself. This can sometimes take several years and then the person has progressed and all these things. But as soon as a diagnosis is made, the person with dementia should sit down with the family or friends and kind of make these decisions whilst they're hopefully still have capacity and then can express their wishes. But in terms of home care, I mean, obviously it'd be preferable if the home carers would know the person prior to an emergency of need. But I think sometimes there's also this element that family carers or unpaid carers want to provide as much as possible and not have any strangers in the home. So they just want to do everything themselves.
So yeah, so kind of going out there and seeking some training for yourself, perhaps, to help you prepare for what's to come. So just a reminder to everybody watching, you can post questions, which I will put to our guests. You can post those in the Zoom using the Q&A button at the bottom or in the comments section on the YouTube. I will try and check Twitter as well, although it's quite hard to pick out the questions because there's quite a lot of tweets using the hashtag. So apologies if I miss those. So coming back to just going around the table now with your advice. So what's your research showing in terms of what is the advice that would help people to live at home as long as possible? Well, let's go to Sarah first.
Well, I think when I'm thinking about the research that I've done in terms of how people see their technologized lives, you've got some people that do feel that their out of home lives can be compensated for using technology. They've got access to the internet. Maybe they want to do their shopping, their banking online. Maybe they've got somebody at home to help them. So that can be something that goes into place. But for somebody else, a kind of shrink back in terms of the technology also coincides with a shrink back of places outside home. So it's taking into account this much bigger picture with the person and really listening really keenly to what somebody has to say. If they're trying to sort of communicate, what they'd like to do is be on a bit of a graceful retreat away from technology, or if they would like some support to be able to keep using technology. And I think there isn't enough sort of interventions and support and ideas for how to promote people's continued use of the technologies that they already have and use and are meaningful to them. And some pitfalls in that if we don't really listen carefully to somebody, particularly if you're a significant other, we call them in our department. If you're a significant other who lives away from the person with dementia and your person with dementia lives alone, if that person's trying to tell you, look, I'm not sure that I could use a computer, you need to pick up on these cues rather than trying to fight it maybe, or think that this is going to be a way to fix a problem, because it really might not be. Technology can be an added complication in the mix that maybe there isn't the support or the context that's available to make that work.
So that's the tricky one, Sarah. So when you, I mean, this doesn't just count for people living with dementia. I think it counts for, you know,
absolutely,
parents and grandparents and others. So when somebody says, no, I don't want a computer, do you you press on that and say, well, actually, let's get you a tablet, it'll work? Or do you just say, okay, fine? I mean, you know, I guess it's
I could tell you the number of tablets I found in the airing cupboard. You know, like, I mean, one of the things that we found in this as well is that if a person receives a technology, there's a reciprocity in this, you know, it's give and take. You don't just get to help and the other person doesn't get something from this. So when a person receives that help, it's quite a complex thing too. They want to be recognized for the fact that they've received your help and what they're bringing to the picture as well. So they want to be appreciated for saying, yes, thank you. We've all got unwanted gifts that we don't want and use, you know, we've all got that, but they then get this meaning to them. You know, there were people who could tell me stories about the technologies that they didn't use or couldn't switch on, but they knew that a particular family member had given it to them. So it meant something to them to bring it up and to have the conversation. So it still worked, but just not in the way that the technology or the person giving the technology intended it to be used.
So, I mean, it comes back to that point. I think communication is clearly key between family members. Even if you live in the same house, don't just assume you know the other person and what they're thinking. You've got to talk about these things. Communicate. Yeah,
because in the worst case scenario, it really kind of can undermine trust. And somebody's wanted to show you that they trust you and they're willing to accept your help and they want to accept your help and they want to build that relationship, but they actually really worry that they're going to let you down and that that's sort of vulnerability, and again it can undermine confidence. So it's treading really carefully.
Monica, what's the kind of pinning you down, synthesizing down all of your research into a couple of things that's really helpful to people? What advice would you be giving? What's your research showing?
I guess just as an overall, to be accepting of home care, and like you said, to just have conversations early about what the person wants, if they want to stay at home, because, you know, some people feel really lonely at home and no amount of home care can make that better. So it's, you know, individual choice with families. But I think from my research, it's sort of for home care and family carers and people with dementia, the take-home messages are, I guess, from speaking to everybody, to value who the person with dementia still is and not to think of it in a black and white way of they can't do this anymore. It's, okay, well, how can we facilitate that so that they can still do parts of that, even if it looks slightly different to what it used to? So, I mean,
I'm noticing perhaps the difference between can't do something and doesn't want to. Mm-hmm. Because I can completely understand that as you progress, you might just, do you know what, I just don't want to do that anymore. I never really did enjoy doing the ironing. I don't want to continue to do the ironing. So get somebody to do the ironing for me. But I agree. What about you, Clarissa? I'm sorry, we're so rushed. These time sessions go so quickly.
It's fine. You've got 56 researchers today. I don't know how you do it.
What's your outputs? Because you've been doing an amazing amount of work on COVID as well. I think anybody who's interested in Clarissa's work on COVID, do have a look on her Twitter feed. I know you've been looking for people to do.
Join our webinar next week.
Look for that. Yep.
I think what came out both in pre-COVID work and in COVID work, in terms of independence and staying at home for as long as possible, if people indeed want that, is that having a family carer or family member or friend that is there to support them is such a vital ingredient to receiving support, not only in terms of them providing them support at home, but actually knowing and going to activities in the community. Because we've been talking to people with dementia and family or unpaid carers, and it's usually them being so proactive, the carers, in finding these groups and activities and taking people there. So if you can imagine someone that has dementia and is living by themselves, they might not be aware of these services or support groups. So
absolutely. And I don't want to jump and assume that they're always there, because we know that there are places in the country where access to services is harder. But you know, don't give up. Do keep looking and try to access those. Thank you very much, Monica, Sarah, Clarissa, for joining us today. As I've mentioned many times already today, details on all the panelists can be found on the website chatham.uk. Also details of their social media, their Twitter feeds, if they're on Twitter. Please do follow follow the guests and have a look at their work, and they do tweet all the time about the stuff that they do, and I'm sure they'll also take questions. Coming next. So sorry, I should say goodbye properly. Thank you, Sarah, Clarissa, Monica.
Bye bye.
Thank you very much for
Well
joining.
done, Adam.
Enjoy your afternoon.